In this video, I'm going to walk through a proposal for how we're going to develop acceptance criteria for sites that will be accepting soil under a new COMM-24 policy. Of course, this is all still up in the air, and a lot, if not all of this, will change in the final policy. Before we get into the fun slides, I want to cover a few key concepts that are the basis of this proposal. The first concept is that these receiving locations will not be located in GW1 areas, and thus we're not going to be concerned about material leaching out of the soil and threatening or contaminating drinking water. Second, the imported soil cannot contain significant amounts of other material that could leach to groundwater and cause other problems, such as vapor intrusion. So we're going to limit the amount of VOCs, and particularly chlorinated VOCs, that could be in this soil. Next, we're going to rule out the imported soil having significant amounts of some other material, such as solid waste, PCBs, or asbestos. Not only could these materials be problematic from a health or environmental risk point of view, but their presence might also complicate matters through the involvement of other state or federal agencies, such as the Solid Waste Program, NESHAPS, or TSCA. And of course, soil which is a hazardous waste must be handled appropriately and be transported or treated or disposed of at a facility that is licensed or permitted to handle hazardous waste. So hazardous waste will also be prohibited from these COMM-24 sites. You should keep in mind that the receiving facility is going to have to achieve a permanent solution under the MCP, and that permanent solution must cover not only the soil that was already at that location, but it must address any soil that is imported under COMM-24. Another important concept is that these receiving locations taking in soil under COMM-24 are part of a 21E site. We are not going to accept applications for importing the soil unless the site has gone through a comprehensive site assessment and an evaluation of remedial alternatives under Phase 3. Therefore, we can count on this site being adequately characterized and the contaminants of concern that are present being well identified. MassDEP should also require that the donor sites, the point of origin for the soil that will be imported, should also be well characterized. Whether a donor site is a 21E site or simply a location undergoing excavation, the performance standards for the donor location soil characterization should be equivalent to that required under the MCP. Whether done under the MCP or not, the soil being excavated should be well characterized, and we should know what the contaminants of concern are and what the concentrations are before the excavation begins. This is the information that will be used to determine whether the soil can go to the COMM-24 location or not. Note that this differs from the way we deal with COMM-15 soil, where we rely upon the sampling of individual truckloads. Under this proposal, the sampling of the trucks is merely confirmatory samples to show that this truck coming from that donor location is consistent with what we already know about the soil at the donor location. The basic concept for the COMM-24 acceptance criteria is that the soil that's being imported cannot be worse than what's already there. It has to be similar to, or better than, what's already at the receiving location. That's great, but what if the receiving location is really contaminated? Should DEP allow really contaminated material to be imported to these COMM-24 receiving sites just because, it's similar to the gross stuff that's already there? I think the answer is no. We shouldn't allow that kind of gross contamination to be imported. So this proposal includes a cap on how high that contamination can be in the imported soil, regardless of whether it's actually similar to the receiving location or not. In fact, there would be two caps. One, a cap on the mean concentration, and another cap on the maximum concentration. Finally, because we're always concerned about consistency, particularly regional consistency, it's worth pointing out here that the soil acceptance criteria that we develop for individual sites under COMM-24 will vary from location to location. No two COMM-24 sites will have the same acceptance criteria because they're going to be based upon what's already at the receiving location. Okay, so now we're going to run through a few examples to illustrate how this would work. Let's start with our receiving site, and it's adequately characterized because it's already gone through phase 2. In fact, we know all about the contaminants of concern and the distribution of concentrations for each and every contaminant of concern. For illustration purposes, I'll be using box and whisker plots to show this distribution, including the minimum, maximum, and mean concentrations. Having identified the concentration distribution for this particular contaminant of concern, we can identify the mean and the maximum values from this distribution and use them as the acceptance criteria when evaluating potential soil to import. To do that, we need similar data from the potential donor location, which has been adequately characterized to either MCP or MCP equivalent performance standards. With that data, we can easily compare the mean to the receiving location mean and the maximum to the receiving location maximum. It looks good. Both values are below the acceptance criteria, so the soil would be acceptable to import. Now let's look at some other potential donor sites. At donor site number 2, the mean concentration is less than the acceptance criteria for the mean at the receiving location. That's great. But if you look over at the right, the maximum concentration is higher than the acceptance criteria for the max. The soil from this site would be rejected. And note that this decision could be made before the trucks even start rolling. In fact, must be made before the trucks start rolling. Our third example has the opposite problem. The maximum concentration meets the acceptance criteria for the maximum value, but the mean is slightly above the acceptance criteria for the mean. And thus, by looking at this data before the trucks start rolling, you already know that the soil from this donor site is not acceptable at the receiving location. So, in these examples, we've been using the mean and the maximum values from our receiving site data as the acceptance criteria. But what if these values at the receiving site really represent truly gross contamination? Are we comfortable letting similar donor soil come back onto the property? Let's now explore how a cap on the mean and a cap on the maximum values could be used. So let's use a receiving location that is more contaminated, where, as we see, the mean concentration and the maximum concentrations are way higher than our previous example. As you see along the x-axis, I have added 2 caps. One, a cap on the mean value for the acceptance criteria, and a cap on the maximum value for the acceptance criteria. These values will only come into play if the mean or maximum values at the receiving site are higher than these concentrations. You will see variations on this, of course. One example would be where the mean concentration is somewhat elevated, but the maximum value is okay. Here, the acceptance criteria would be the cap on the mean and the maximum value from the receiving site distribution. Conversely, you could have an example where the mean is okay, but the maximum value is really high. In this case, the acceptance criteria would be the mean of the receiving site distribution plus the cap on the maximum value. If it sounds good so far, let's think about how this would actually look in the COMM-24 policy. What we want, is a table of acceptance criteria to be in the appendix. But since the acceptance criteria will be site-specific and will vary from one site to another, we can't just have one table. What we can have is a table that leads you through the process and could result in a table of acceptance criteria that would go into the ACO for any given approval. Here's what that table would look like. In the left-hand column, you'd have the list of chemicals. We can fill out the middle columns, columns C and D, because these are standard values that we're going to take out of the MCP. For the cap on the mean, I would suggest 2 times the method 2 direct contact concentrations. For the cap on the max, I would suggest the method 3 sealing limit. These suggestions are placeholders. Feel free to suggest alternatives. As part of the application process, we would require the proponent to come to the table with a list of chemical mean concentrations and maximum concentrations as part of the package they're submitting. This data could be used to fill out columns A and B. With the first 5 columns of the table already filled out, it will be easy then to determine the site-specific acceptance criteria for this receiving location, both for the mean and for the max. The mean acceptance criteria would be the lower of column A and column C. The acceptance criteria for the max would be the lower of column B and column D. Since the proponent will have the necessary site-specific information, and the rest of it will be in the COMM-24 policy, the proponent's application package should include a table that proposes the acceptance criteria for their site based upon this methodology. So the final COMM-24 policy would have an appendix which describes this process and would contain a table similar to the one you're looking at now that has columns C and D filled out for the contaminants of concern that we want people to sample for, and then space left in columns A and B for them to fill that out, and then the last 2 columns would be determined based upon the comparison to find the lower of the applicable numbers.